We continue now at the top of Daf Kuftes Zayin Amid Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 116b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a pasuk by Rochav Hazona and Sefer Yoshua, where it's mentioned that the nations were in fear when they heard about Kriyas Yamsuf, and the Gemara noted that the pasuk uses a different language over there. It says V'lo kama od ruach, and the Gemara asked why that different language, and the Gemara now continues and answers Diafilu akshuye nami lo akshu. It means to indicate that they did not even become hard. Rashi explains Diafilu akshuye aver latashmish lo akshu. It means that their aver did not become hard, latashmish, for having relations because they were in such fear. That's the reference in the pasuk. V'hi shahisa yodas bedavar. Now Rochav Hazona, she knew about this, as we're going to see in a moment. So Amra l'shalucha Yoshua b'lashon zeh. That's why she said this over to the messengers of Yoshua in this language, as the Gemara now continues and explains. Umena yoda, how did she know this? The Amar Mar, because the master said, Ein lach kol sar v'noged. There was no nobleman shelo baal Rochav Hazona who did not have relations with Rochav Hazona. Amru, they said, Bas Yud Shanim Haisa K'sheyatzu Yisrael miMitzrayim. She was 10 years old when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim. V'zonsa kol mem shana shahayu Yisrael b'midbar. She committed acts of znus all 40 years that Klal Yisrael was in the midbar. Achar nun shana, and after 50 years in the Skyra she converted. And Amra, she said, Yehei macholi, it should be forgiven to me, all of my sins should be forgiven. B'schar chevel chalonu pishtim, as a reward for the rope and the window and the flax that were used to save the men, again in the story in the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. And Rashi explains, the Amar Mar, the master said, B'mechilta b'Parshas Yisro, this is the Mechilta in Parshas Yisro. Amra, she said, Yimchol ali b'shvil chevel upishtem avachalon. Rashi says, B'mechilta tanya hachi. The Mechilta is taught as follows in the Braisa. Amra, she said, Ribona Shalom, Begimel Dvarim Chatasi. There were 3 things that I sinned with, and Begimel Yimchol, and there should be 3 things that I'm forgiven with. And the idea is B'chevel upishtem v'chalon. I sinned with rope and flax and window. Shayu menafim olen eleh b'chavolim, because those who were committing adultery would go up ropes to climb up to her, derech achalon, by way of the window, v'yardim, and they would go down, v'gam tamantim b'pishtei ha'etz, and they would hide in the flax, uva'osan shlosha devarim atzman zochsa lahatzal ashluchim, and it was with those 3 things that she merited to save the agents of Yehoshua. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. Amar Mar, the master said, this is from the Brisa earlier, V'ovdei kochavim bizman hazeh rashoin lasos kein. Ovdei kochavim, nowadays they're allowed to bring offerings on a bama, even though that's forbidden. For Klal Yisrael, it's okay for ovdei kochavim. The Gemara says, Minahani Mili, from where do we know this? To Tanu Rabbanan, because the sages taught in the Brisa, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, it says, speak to b'nei Yisrael. And we understand from there, b'nei Yisrael mitzuven al shchutei chutz. There's a commandment about shchutei chutz. You're not allowed to offer outside the Beis HaMikdash. That's to b'nei Yisrael. Of the Kochavim mitzuven al shchutei chutz, but of the Kochavim are not instructed regarding shchutei chutz. Lafikach, therefore, kol echad v'yechad bona lo bama liatzmo. Each individual, meaning Ovid Kochavim, can build a bama for himself. Umakriv aleh kol masha yirtz, and offer on it anything that he wants. Amar Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, Amar Ravasi. Rabbi Yaakov Baracha says that Ravasi says, Asur l'sayon v'laso shlichus, and it's asur for Klal Yisrael to help them in doing this, or to be agents of theirs in doing this. In other words, they're the ones that have to do it on their own. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Ula urin hulu shari, but to instruct them what to do, that is permitted. And the Gemara continues, Kiyad de Ifra Hormuz ime de Shvor Malka. It's like the story, the incident with Ifra Hormuz, who was the mother of Shvor Malka, of King Shapur. Shadra Korbana l'Rava, she sent a korban to Rava. Shalchalei, and she sent him, Askua nihile l'shem shamayim, offer it up l'shem shamayim. Amar lu l'Rav Safra l'Rav Acha bar Huna, he said to Rav Safra and Rav Acha bar Huna, Zilu v'dabru trei ulmei guloi v'chazu heicha demasku yamasirton. Go and get 2 people, 2 individuals who are ovdei kochavim, of the same age, and see where the sea brings up silt. V'shaklu tzive charati, and take new wood. V'apiku nura mimora charata, and get fire from new vessels. V'askua nihile l'shem shamayim, and then offer it up l'shem shamayim. In other words, this is going to be the choicest way of offering up the korban. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Abai, Abai said to him, Kiman, who are you following in doing this? Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, it seems to be following Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, Omer, Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua says, Ma mizbeach shelo yishtamish bo hedyo, just like the mizbeach, it's not used by a regular individual. Af eitzim shelo yishtamish bo hedyo, so too the wood should be new, it should never have been used. But v'hamod Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua b'bama, but doesn't Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua admit that by a bama there's no requirement for new wood? So why are you following this stringency over here? And where do we see that? The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Kasav echad Omer, one pasuk says, Vayiten David la'arnon b'makom shiklei zav mishkal sheish meos. It talks about 600 shekel. But it's also written, Vayiken David es hagoron ves habakar b'kesav shkalim chamishim. It says David bought the area with 50 shekels. So was it 50? Was it 600? Haketzad, how so? Gova mikol shevet v'shevet chamishim. He collected 50 shekel from every tribe. Shein sheish meos. So 50 times all the shvatim, it comes out to 600. And the Brisa continues, Rebbe Yomer, Rebbe says, Mishum Abba Yossi ben Dustoi, in the name of Abba Yossi ben Dustoi, Bokar ve'etzim u'makom mizbeach, the Bokar and the Eitzim, the wood, and the makom mizbeach, the place of the mizbeach benun, that was 50 shekel. V'chol habayis kulo b'sheish meos, but the entire Beis HaMikdash, that was 600. Rebbe Lozer ben Shamua, Omer Rebbe Lozer ben Shamua says, Bokar ve'etzim u'makom mizbeach benun, same idea. The Bokar, Eitzim, and mizbeach, makom mizbeach are for 50. V'chol habayis kulo b'sheish meos, and the entire bayis was 600. Techsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, Vayomer Arnon el David Yikach v'yal Adonai Hamelech hatov be'inav ra habakar la'olav ha'morigim uchle habakar la'etzim. And the point over here is that David HaMelech purchased these instruments for use as wood. It doesn't seem to be that there's a requirement of new wood. V'Rav Amar Loch, but Rav will say to you, Hasam Nami B'Charati. There also, it's talking about new, they were never used, and therefore it does not contradict what we said earlier. And Rashi explains, Asr L'Sayin, it's also for us to help them in terms of making a bama and offering up on a bama. B'Shas Isser HaBamos, this is again at the time when bamos are Asr, Kagon Bizman Hazed, the Kedushas Yerushalayim Ein Acharei Heter. For example, nowadays, the Kedushas Yerushalayim, there is no heter after Yerushalayim is sanctified, and oroye lahen hechiasu, but to instruct them what to do, that's permitted, as the story that the Gemara brought, Zilu dabru trein ulmei giloi, go bring two young men who are of the same age, l'chu kachu shnei ovdei kochavim bachurim, two ovdei kochavim who are young, b'nei gil echa, that they're the same age, shekein noi ledavar, that's a more beautiful offering to HaKadosh Baruch Hu if they're involved, and go to a place, Damaska Yamosirton, go to the place where the steed brings up silt to Mesiabish and then becomes dry, Vinasa Karkan becomes earth. Devoinon Shalom Nishtamish Hedyur b'Mizbeach. Again, the point is, it has to be an area where a regular individual didn't use the Mizbeach. Everything has to be totally new. V'aisu tzivi charati, and bring new wood. Shalom Nishtamish ben Adam, that nobody used. Shalom Yeh Shivrei Kalim, and shouldn't be from vessels. V'afku Nura Mimora Charata, and bring the fire from a new vessel. And Rashi says, Nir Elishu Pushir Shel Istam Shemotzian Bo Eshman Hu Avonim. It was something that they used to create the fire from stones. And Rashi continues, Hachi Garsin, and the proper text is as follows, Kiman Rav Elazar ben Shamu. Who is it following? It's following Rav Elazar ben Shamua. The Tanya Rav Elazar ben Shamua, Omer Mam Mizbeach of Torah's Kohanim, Hishnuya b'Parsha Rishona. This is in Torah's Kohanim. Kosav Echad Omer, one pasuk says, and Rashi says, Brisa Zum Meshubashas b'Sforim. This Brisa has mistakes in the Sforim. Ushnuyahi b'Sifri b'Birchas Kohanim v'Kachi Shnuya. This is the proper text of the Brisa. Haketzad, how so? Mokom Mizbeach b'Chamishim. The location of the Mizbeach was 50 shekel. V'chol habayis b'sheish meos, and the whole Beis HaMikdash was 600. Rebbe Omer b'shem Abba Yossi ben Dustoi. Rebbe says in the name of Abba Yossi ben Dustoi, Govam he called Shevet Chamishim Shein Sheish Meos. He collected from the 12 tribes, 50 each. That comes out to 600. Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua, Omer Rebbe Elazar ben Shamua says, Vayiken David es hagoren. He bought the goren, the threshing floor. Kinim eforish be'inyan, as is explained. Vayiten David larona b'mokom shiklei zav mishkal sheish meos. He gave the weight of 600. Aval habakar liolav hamorigim uchle habakar le'etzim b'kesav shkalim chamishim. But the bakar liola, the morigim, the clay bakar le'etzim, all of that was for 50 shekel. Vayomer Arona, and Arona said, V'hachi perusha dekra. And here's the explanation of the pasuk. Vayiken David es hagoren. It says that he bought the threshing floor. V'lo perish b'mekano. It doesn't say what he bought it with. Sharei perishu b'makom acher kvar. It's already explained somewhere else. It says in Divrei Yomim, Vayiten David larona b'makom v'es habakar kana b'kesav shkalim chamishim. And Rashi continues, Hamoder Rebbe Elazar b'bama. But again, Rebbe Elazar would admit by a bama that you don't need it to be new wood. The katani hamorigim lokach David lo'etzim kedvar Arona. He bought these instruments, which presumably those were used, and he used that for the eitzim. It sounds essentially like he had broken kalim for the wood. Mishkal sheish meos, it was 600. L'kamim meforish kesef shava mishkal sheish meos zav. The Gemara will soon explain that it means it's made of silver. These are shekel of silver, but they are the value of 600 that are of gold. And again, the Gemara then answered that Rava will say this pasuk, even though it mentions the morigim, they were new, and therefore if they were new again, they satisfy that requirement. And the Gemara continues, "My morigim, what are these instruments for the threshing that are referred to in the pasuk?" Amar Ula says, "Mita shel torbel." It's a torbel bed. My mita shel torbel. What's a torbel bed? Amar Abaya says, "Iza de karkasa de daishan dishoy." It is a serrated board that's used for threshing. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, "My crow." What's the pasuk that indicates this? The pasuk in Yeshayahu says, "Hinei samtich lemorag chorutz chodosh bal pipios." The pasuk here is referencing a threshing board which has sharp teeth, again indicating that it is serrated. And the Gemara continues, "Makri le Rava livrei v'rami le kroi hadadi." Rava was teaching his son. He had the following contradiction in psukim. Again, the same psukim as above. Ksiv it's written vayita and David la'arnon, uksiv vayik and David haketzad. How so? Again, is it 600? Is it 50 shekel? The answer is gova mikol shevet v'shevet chamishim shehein sheish meos. He collected from each shevet 50 shekel, which ended up as a total of 600. But the Gemara asks, this is what Rashi mentioned earlier, Ve'akati kashin hadodi hasam kesef hachazav. We still have a question whether the shkolim are kesef or zav. And the Gemara says, Alachi kamar, means to say as follows, Gova kesef, he collected silver shekel b'mishkal sheish meo zav, but they were at the weight of 600 gold. And again, that reconciles the contradiction in the psukim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Kachim kalim necholim b'chol machane Yisrael. Karbanos of lesser holiness could be eaten in all of machane Yisrael. This is when the Mishkan was traveling in the Midbar. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, B'chol mekomos Yisrael avol machane lo have. In all places of Yisrael, but it doesn't mean the machane. Rashi explains, B'chol mekomos Yisrael kasal kadaitach. Initially we think, Hashta, right now we think, Da'afilu yotza echad mehen chutz l'machane Yisrael. It means to say, even if somebody would leave the machane Yisrael, ochel kachim kalam sham, one could eat kachim kalam over there. In other words, when it says b'chol machane Yisrael, it doesn't have to actually be eaten in the camp of Yisrael. It could be eaten anywhere. That's what the Mishnah actually means. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei Rav Nachman lo Rav Huna. Rav Nachman asks Rav Huna, u'machanos b'midbar lo havoy. Were there no machanos in the midbar? There were no restrictions. V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, kashem shemachane b'midbar, just like there was a camp in the midbar, kach machane b'Yerushalayim, so too they were encampments, so to speak, in Yerushalayim. M'Yerushalayim laharabayis machane Yisrael, from Yerushalayim to the Temple Mount is called machane Yisrael. Meharabayis l'shar Nikanor machane Levia, from the Temple Mount to Shar Nikanor, that's the gate, into the Azara, that's the machane Levia. And mikan vo'elach machane Shechina, and from there on is the machane Shechina, v'hein hein kloim sheba midbar, and that is the same as the kloim, as the curtains that were in the midbar. Those represent essentially the machane Shechina. Rashi explains, Shar Nikanor shel Azara hoya Shar HaMizrach, that was the eastern gate of the Azara. V'hein hein kloim sheva midbar, meaning lifnim mishar Nikanor, when one was within Shar Nikanor, have a kimakom lifnim min akloim v'mishkan, that was the same as being within the curtains in the Mishkan. Again, that was considered to be the machane Shechina. And so that's why, again, from Harabayis to Shar Niknor's machane Levia, from Shar Niknor and within there, that's the machane Shechina, which is the same as the kloim in the midbar. But the point is, you see clearly there are camps even when they were in the midbar, and so therefore it couldn't be taken. The kachim kalim couldn't be taken to be eaten anywhere. And the Gemara continues and says, Ella ema, rather say b'chol makom machane Yisrael. What it means is in all places of machane Yisrael. Rashi explains, ema b'chol makomos machane Yisrael. It means shafila b'shas siluk masos. Let's say they were now traveling, so you had some kachim kalim, and then they traveled in the midbar. So ein nifsalim, that would not disqualify. It wouldn't be disqualified through yotze, through leaving the proper area. Elamo lichanimo, he would take it with him. Uvamakam chaniyasan, and then when they would camp again, ochlim b'machane, they would make sure to eat it in the machane. That is the meaning of when it says again b'chol makomos. It simply means b'chol makom machane Yisrael. And the Gemara continues and says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? The Gemara says, no, Mao Detema, what might you have said if Salu b'Yotze? Maybe there's a disqualification of Yotze while they were traveling, because it now technically left the Machane, Kamash Malon, so it's teaching us there's no such disqualification. The Gemara says, Ve'im hachinami, well, why don't we say indeed that there should be that disqualification? The Gemara says, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, V'nosa oel moed, the oel moed traveled, Afal pisha nosa oel moed hu, even though it traveled, it is still referred to as the oel moed. And the Gemara continues, Tanya will end in a brayso of Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Of Shimon ben Yochai says, Od acheres haisa, there was another one, V'chel ezras nashim, it was the ezras nashim, the courtyard of the women. V'lo hayu onshen olah, there was no punishment for it. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Uv'shilo lo hayu ela shnei machanos bilvad, and in Shiloh there were only two machanos, even though we said there were three machanos in general, but when the Mishkan was in Shiloh there were only two. The Gemara asks, Haiminayu lo have, which one was not there in Shiloh? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba says, some change this to to Abaya. Abaya says, Mistabra de Machane Levia Hava. It makes sense to say that Machane Levia was there. Disal Gadaitach Machane Levia Lo Havoy, because if you think Machane Levia was not there. And Rashi explains, Oda Cheres Hoisa Machane Revias, there was actually a fourth camp, Chaluka me Harabayas me Azora. It was distinct from the Harabayas and the Azora. V'lo hayu onshanala, there was no punishment al hanichnas lo betumah if one would enter there in tumah. But Meseches Kelim meforish maihi chalukasu me Harabayas. In Meseches Kelim, it explains what the difference is between this Ezras Noshim and the Harabayas. The Machane Levia Mia Havoy, and the Gemara said Machane Levia was there. Umachane Yisrael hu dechasr, meaning the Machane Yisrael was missing in Shiloh. Dimlo kain the Machane Yisrael Havoy v'lo Machane Levia, because if you would say the opposite, the Machane Yisrael was there and not Machane Levia. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph.